Majors and Quinn Booksellers. My name is Annie, and I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn, which is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota, for those of you who do not know. If it's your first time viewing one of our events, we're so happy to have you. If not, welcome back. We appreciate your continued support of our events program, even as it transitioned over to virtual. Thank you so much for being here. This evening, I am very, very pleased to welcome author Viet Than Nguyen, who will be speaking about his new book, The Committed. And we're also so happy that we have friend of the store and Twin Cities-based author Bao Phi joining him in conversation. So Bao and Viet, thank you so much for being here. Some of you viewers are joining us because you've already purchased a copy of The Committed from Majors and Quinn, and if that's the case, thank you so much. If you have not yet done so, I'll be dropping a link to the book on our website in the comments on this video, so you can head straight there after the event if you so choose. Speaking of the comments, please talk to us. I see some of you are already doing that. That's great. Let us know where you're tuning in from, say hi, and also ask questions. We will have time to take a few questions at the end of the hour, so feel free to write them whenever they occur to you. We'll go back through them and take as many as we can. So now, on to the show. I'm going to introduce our two speakers tonight. Viet Than Nguyen was born in Vietnam and raised in America. He is the author of The Sympathizer, which was awarded the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It is probably also one of the books I have hand-sold the most in my book-selling history. He's the author of the short story collection, The Refugees, and the nonfiction books, Nothing Ever Dies and Race and Resistance. He teaches English and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California and lives in Los Angeles. Viet, thank you so much for being here. And Bao Phi is a Vietnamese-American Minnesotan raised in the Phillips neighborhood of South Minneapolis. A published poet, a spoken word artist, a children's book author, a nonprofit arts administrator at the Loft Literary Center, and a father, he's currently working and raising his child in Powderhorn, and he knew Viet before it was cool. Bao, thank you so much for being here. And I am so looking forward to your conversation, and I will be back at the end of the hour to take questions. See you later, guys.
Cool. Thank you, Annie. Thank you for letting me do this with one of my favorite authors. I'm assuming Marlon James was busy, which is why he wasn't the one asking questions today. But, you know, there are worse things than being second place to Marlon James.
Oh, come on. You were the first choice on the way. Anyway, it's really good to be here with you, Bao.
Yeah. No, it's good to be with you. So you know, besides everyone in America wanting to deport or kill us, how the hell are you doing today?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Doing okay. You know, this is my second interview of the day, my favorite one. I did Seth Meyers earlier, but I really wanted to talk to you.
Of course. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Another Vietnamese brother, you know, but always been a big admirer of your slam poetry and performances and your political convictions and your public self. So really wonderful to be here.
Well, I mean, obviously, hopefully, you know, I feel the same way about you. We knew each other. We've known each other for a while. And, you know, I got to say, man, this new book, I will talk about it in a moment, but, you know, it's just, it is, for those of you who haven't read it yet, it is like a force of nature. I mean, we're going to talk about the swagger you got, Viet. Like, it is off the hook and well-deserved. I just love it. I'm reading it and just like blown away. And, you know, like before we get into our conversation, do you mind just reading a short passage from it? And we'll talk.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay, great. So, you know, just for those of you who haven't read The Sympathizer, it's okay. You know, this book is designed, it's a sequel to the Sympathizer, but it's designed to stand on its own. There's enough, you know, references to what happened before, so you can just jump right into The Committed. But I highly recommend that you do read The Sympathizer, obviously. You can borrow it from the library, it's all right. But just to refresh your memory, The Sympathizer, the novel, it's about a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army in 1975. And when Saigon falls or is liberated, depending on your point of view, his task is to flee with the remnants of that army to the United States, where he's going to spy on their efforts to take their country back. And by the end of the book, he's back in Vietnam and he becomes a refugee again. And the last we see of him, he's about to go to sea on a refugee boat. So The Committed picks up exactly where The Sympathizer leaves off, and that's what I'll be reading to you right now. He and 150 other people are on this refugee boat, and they are now on the sea. We, the unwanted, wanted so much. We wanted food, water, and parasols, although umbrellas would be fine. We wanted clean clothes, baths, and toilets, even of the squatting kind, since squatting on land was safer and less embarrassing than clinging to the bulwark of a rolling boat with one's posterior hanging over the edge. We wanted rain, clouds, and dolphins. We wanted it to be cooler during the hot day and warmer during the freezing night. We wanted an estimated time of arrival. We wanted not to be dead on arrival. We wanted to be rescued from being barbecued by the unrelenting sun. We wanted television, movies, music, anything with which to pass the time. We wanted love, peace, and justice, except for our enemies, whom we wanted to burn in hell, preferably for eternity. We wanted independence and freedom, except for the communists, who should all be sent to re-education, preferably for life. We wanted benevolent leaders who represented the people, by which we meant us, and not them, whoever they were. We wanted to live in a society of equality, although if we had to settle for owning more than our neighbor, that would be fine. We wanted a revolution that would overturn the revolution we had just lived through. In sum, we wanted to want for nothing. What we most certainly did not want was a storm, and yet that was what we got on the seventh day. The faithful once more cried out, God, help us. The non-faithful cried out, God, you bastard. Faithful or unfaithful, there was no way to avoid the storm dominating the horizon and surging closer and closer. Whipped into a frenzy, the wind gained momentum, and as the waves grew, our ark gained speed and altitude. Lightning illuminated the dark furrows of the storm clouds, and thunder overwhelmed our collective groan. A torrent of rain exploded on us, and as the waves propelled our vessel ever higher, the faithful prayed and the unfaithful cursed, but both wept. Then our ark reached its peak, and for an eternal moment perched on the snow-capped crest of a watery precipice. Looking down on that deep, wine-colored valley awaiting us, we were certain of two things. The first was that we were absolutely going to die. And the second was that we would almost certainly live. Yes, we were sure of it. We will live. And then we plunged, howling, into the abyss.
Wow. And that's from the prologue. I mean, one hell of a beginning. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, it's just nonstop. Like I dog-eared almost every page. You know, I go through books and I dog-ear the pages where I'm like, oh, that like this right here is, you know, and it's basically every page of your new novel. Thank you for the catch-up, for the synopsis of people who did not yet read The Sympathizer. Naughty. But there's still time. Definitely read it. And, you know, like, I think that ties into like my first question for you. You know, I'm reading this book and, you know, it's definitely not nice. Like, it's quite naughty. I kept thinking to myself, Viet's being very naughty as I read through this. And I mean that in the highest compliment. And when I'm reading it, it just, it made me think of The Sympathizer, because what I appreciated about The Sympathizer was that, you know, in Western culture, it seems like in literature, and I would say in representation, we Vietnamese people, right? We're pushed into this binary of like helpless victim or evil victimizer, or like enemy, right? Like those are the two binaries that people kind of see our people in. But with The Sympathizer, and now with the same character in The Committed, I mean, it feels very transgressive because your protagonist is both, right? And also the genius of the two books is that somehow your character is actually greater than the sum of those two parts coming together, in my opinion.
Like, yeah, and you know what? The first thing I want to say is it's great talking to you, because I think you are the first Vietnamese American I'm having a conversation with in public about this book. And when I first saw you perform your work, I felt like I was the ideal audience for Bao Phi. Maybe you don't think so, but I thought, oh, good,
No,
because there's a lot of swagger there too. There's a lot of refusal to cater. There's a lot of anger, passionate, good, righteous anger in your work that I really responded to. And that was, again, sort of the ambition that I had for both of these novels. It's like, I'm really happy if other people come along for the ride, other people from other backgrounds and all of that kind of thing. But really, I want to first of all be able to speak to someone like Bao Phi. and so you're absolutely right. That for better and for worse, if you're Vietnamese from Vietnam or here in the United States, you're defined in the Western imagination for many people through the Vietnam War and through the way the war has been narrated by Americans, right? And that means that we are pinned to American obsessions, and the way that they look at Vietnamese people is very two-dimensional. So we only exist relative to American desires and fears and American discussions and all of that. And the reason why that's important for people who are not Americans is because American power is so powerful. The American obsessions are broadcast all over the world, and people, no matter where they are, know the Vietnam War through these American movies and the American stories and all of that. So we who are Vietnamese trying to tell our stories are faced with this immense machinery of storytelling power that goes hand in hand, or not hand in hand, gear in gear, with the military industrial complex of the United States. It's all the same.
Right.
And so, these novels are designed to try to do my best to put a little toothpick or chopstick, you want to use that, in the gears of the war machine and the storytelling. And it's a hard task, right? But, part of what that means is that I try not to apologize or to go half-heartedly, and I think part of the way that our own capacity to tell stories that's been taken away from us is that we are not allowed or not expected to be angry or to be both the victim and the victimizer at the same time, in the same way that Americans claim this territory for themselves. Whatever you think of a movie like Apocalypse Now, which I deal with in The Sympathizer, that movie is symbolic of the American capacity to claim all of the territory of storytelling for itself. I mean, no one watches Apocalypse Now and thinks, gosh, all Americans commit massacres. They don't think that. It's just like, this is just a human story of what it means to be inhuman. And this is what these two novels are about.
Absolutely. And, to answer your question, absolutely, folks like you are my target audience. And I think it goes right to my next point, and it's not this kind of idea of nationalism, because I think you and I both have experienced our own people not necessarily liking us very much, right? Because so I like to think of a very slim margin of Vietnamese and Asian Americans who I like to think of as progressive, leftist, misanthropic people. That's really who we are and our audiences. And along those lines, I mean, in your book, in both books, and your work in general, again, talking about binaries, right? Our people, Vietnamese people, can sometimes be pushed or led to a certain very rigid, conservative, pro-American, anti-communist stance, right? Or conversely, take on a position that romanticizes communism, right? But you refuse to throw your allegiance completely to either side, and you end up being very critical of everyone in your work, right? Like no one is spared.
Yeah, I mean, the way I like to put it is, I want to offend everybody, the Sympathizer was designed deliberately to offend Americans, communist Vietnamese, anti-communist Vietnamese, and I think I succeeded, judging from hate mail and emails and all of that. And then The Committed is, after that, I was like, who else am I going to offend? Well, the French, obviously, that's what happens in The Committed, which goes to Paris in 1982. But I think for a lot of us who are, writers of color, or who come from so-called minority communities, maybe there's an impulse to want to be liked by our own people, our own communities, right?
Yeah.
And we want to do service for them and all that kind of stuff. But really, I think that's an admirable attitude. It reflects our filial piety and all that kind of thing, But I think writers should be disliked, and the more that people dislike me, it doesn't make me want to change. The more people dislike me, the more I think, good. This is exactly what you're supposed to do. Like if you are an unmarked writer, like a beat poet or something like that, the expectation is that you are going to be critical of dominant American culture because it's screwed up. There's so many things you can be critical of. So that in my position, I feel like, I'm caught. I'm going to speak for myself, and maybe it applies to others, but like I'm caught in a double bind because as a so-called minority or as a refugee, I'm expected to be grateful to the United States for the American dream. So therefore, I can't be critical of the United States. And then for my own people, the Vietnamese people, it's like I'm expected to be filial to them. So you're kind of like caught both ways. But which means that when we rebel, we have to rebel both ways too. We can't just do one or the other. And that, again, that's what the project of these two books is about. And I think that hopefully there are people like us, Vietnamese people, but also other Americans and people all over the world who are, willing to be offensive and misanthropic and all that, who would appreciate the message of the not very nice, naughty messages of these books.
Right. And, like I would just add, I agree with everything you said. And I would just add that you would think that our people, after all we've been through, know the dangers of this idea of ideological purity, right? Because we've seen, I think there's a line, right, in your new book, like those who desire revolution are people who've never lived through one, right? Like we've seen personally how the idea of ideological purity can be used by people across the political spectrum, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the fact that I was born in Vietnam, and although I left at a very young age, has really influenced me. That I can't leave the country behind, and that I often think, what would have happened if my family had stayed, or what would have happened if I'd been born 15 years earlier? What kind of choices would I make? So there's always a sense of parallel histories, alternate universes that preoccupy me. And part of that is about this question of revolution and ideological purity and everything like that. I think revolutions looked at in the abstract can be great. There are a lot of people all over the world who looked at Vietnam and the struggle there and the revolution and all that and said, hey, Vietnam is the template for global struggle against imperialism. And that's great in the abstract, but in the lived reality of things, it was so much messier. Families were divided, communities were divided, people were internally divided, and that again is what the character of the sympathizer is about. That the scariest person to me is the one who not only believes in revolution but believes in it absolutely without any doubt, because those people are going to be the ones who just are okay with like killing everybody.
Right.
So obviously, war, revolution, struggle can entail death, but to approach it without hesitation is really, really problematic. And so the sympathizer is a character in both of these. In the first book, who believes in revolution, but he's deeply ambivalent. Yeah. Because he's able to empathize with the other side.
Right.
And in the committed, he's been disabused of the communist revolution in the first book, but he still wants a revolution. He still believes that it's important to have justice and that there's injustice and that you need to change things. He just doesn't know what kind of revolution he wants. So the committed picks up that question, what does a revolutionary from a failed revolution do to continue his revolutionary pursuit of justice? So that's the terrain, and there's always a refusal of ideological purity, because I think he recognizes that that ideological purity, the people who believe in it, are always going to be out there trying to purify the impure with terrible consequences.
Right. And speaking of, so the new novel is set in France, right? And for those of you who don't know Vietnamese history, France was a colonial power of us Vietnamese folks, right? And in this novel, there's also conflict between Vietnamese gangsters and Algerian gangsters, right, who are also a colonized people. So how did you approach, number one, you as a Vietnamese American, how did you approach the craft of writing a Vietnamese mixed blood person in Paris, right? And also, how did you approach and what tensions did you have writing about another marginalized, colonized group in conflict with Vietnamese people?
Well, I think for this, when I created the character of the Sympathizer, I deliberately made him mixed race. His father's a French priest who molested this young Vietnamese woman who is his mother. And the reason I did that was because, thematically, it was crucial because I wanted the Sympathizer to be a spy novel and a war novel, but also a novel that was a commentary on all these Orientalist ideas of East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet. And that was kind of a dangerous move already in some ways, because by creating a mixed race person who is torn between two cultures and two worlds, the man of two faces and two minds, that's already verging on a stereotype about mixed race people, always being conflicted. I guess it worked because nobody, trust me, I get lots of hate mail, but no one has written an angry email or hate mail saying you got this wrong and how dare you exploit this stereotype. Instead, I get a lot of messages from mixed race people saying, hey, thanks for doing this. And the other reason why I did it is because I didn't want to give Vietnamese people the representational way out by them saying, hey, we're so proud to, that we have a Vietnamese character here. Because the whole point, one of the points of having him be mixed race is to point out that he's getting racism from both sides. The French, the Americans, the white Americans, and from Vietnamese people. There were a lot of Eurasians and Amerasians in Vietnam, obviously as a result of having French and American soldiers there, and they just, they experienced a lot of racism from Vietnamese people, and so that was the point, is like to try to force Vietnamese people to confront their own racism. I don't know how effective that has been, because I'm not, not a lot of Vietnamese. After the novel was successful, a lot of Vietnamese people who had not paid any attention to it were then like, now we claim you on our Vietnamese side, but if you claim it, you got to claim all of it, right?
Right.
As for the Algerian gangsters, it's the same thing. It's like, I worried a lot about this issue of writing about Algerian gangsters. So I don't know, and until the novel is translated into French and people can read it there, I don't know what they're going to say about this representation. But first of all, it may be going into dangerous territory to write a novel set in France to cast the Algerians as gangsters for obvious reasons.
Right.
And yet the novel is a crime novel. Our Sympathizer goes to Paris and he's been traumatized by the events of the Sympathizer, the novel, and he makes bad choices and he becomes a drug dealer.
Right.
And so everybody's, there are a lot of gangsters in this book, and so
like everybody in the book is a gangster, basically.
Yeah, right. So the Algerians are not being necessarily treated any worse by being depicted as gangsters. They're facing a gang of ethnic Chinese from Vietnam, and so everybody's bad, in this book. And I think, again, going back to the idea of Apocalypse Now, I think this is actually kind of, for me, I don't know if it's respectful is the right word, but it's like, hey, we shouldn't be casting ourselves and other people who are also people of color or colonized peoples as angels. That's not what colonization does to people. It doesn't, just because we were victimized doesn't mean that we somehow came out better as a result. Oftentimes we come out, pretty damaged because of that. And so these are two colonized populations in Paris who are doing bad things, who come into conflict with each other. And I think hopefully I give the Algerian gangsters enough subjectivity, enough history, enough of their own dialogue that even though they are supporting characters in this book, we can still see behind them a whole world of their own experiences and of their own colonization that's being brought into play.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple parts, and this is some minor spoilers for those of you out there. It is really minor, but there's some specificity in it. That I'm just wondering if you can talk about how you got this information. Like, for instance, there's a hilarious moment where your main character, he hears some slang, Arab slang, and he thinks it's butter, but it's actually slang for something else. And then there's this really, I think, amazing scene where an Algerian is actually teaching your main character how to like call him a racial epithet, you know, like in a way that I think is just really disturbing in a good way, right? And that there's like a lot of specificity in your novel, and I'm wondering if you could talk about like how did you get there? You know what I mean, with the specifics of certain moments like
Well,
that.
I mean, I got to spend a couple of summers in Paris specifically for this novel, but I've been to Paris before, and you know, honestly, I'm mentally colonized. What can I say? I like France. I like Paris. I like French culture. Like
Yeah.
the French language. You can say the stupidest things to me in French. I'm like, oh wow, that's pretty cool. And and I'm like, my son goes to a French international school, and I'm enrolled in French myself. So I just want to make sure this little 7-year-old kid is not going to have his own secret language from me. I mean, inevitably he's going to be better at French than I am, but at least I should be able to understand what he's going to say. And so, you know, there's wordplay in the book between different languages, and so that's the answer to your first question. You know, the French of sort of North African descent have their own slang, and one of the slang terms to describe them is beurre, B-E-U-R, I think. And you know, if you're French pronouncing, you know, if you're not completely fluent in French, then that can sound a little bit like beurre, butter. And so there's a moment when, you know, our narrator is being assaulted by these Algerian gangsters, and they call themselves beurre, but he thinks that why are they calling themselves butter? He can't quite figure it out yet. So there's some fun with different kinds of wordplay there. And you know, the epithet scene, you know, I wanted to know what are the epithets that people use in French language to call certain peoples, including people of Asian descent. So there's a whole Wikipedia page, for example, with all these terms. And I had the novel read by, you know, at least a couple of people who were French speakers and who were also colonized themselves, and you know, just make sure that I got these racial epithets wrong. But you know, it reminds me of the fact that you know, both of these novels are, you know, they also try to be comic and satirical, and you know, I take a lot of inspiration from, you know, comedians who go into this very dangerous territory where again, you know, we can mock ourselves, and we can go into the territory of the scatological and the vile and the obscene, not gratuitously, I hope, but we go there because these things emerge exactly out of the history that makes us.
Right.
And so we should be able to confront it, and in that way, you know, own it ourselves.
Absolutely. And you know, with that, there's you know, in the first book, there was in the Sympathizer, there was kind of this you know, your tricky parody event was basically a movie set that was kind of like Apocalypse Now, right? In the Committed, there's Fantasia, right, which is a cultural show where the colonized enact kind of a cultural display and gratitude to the colonizers, right? So there's Vietnamese people, Arab people, there's Black Americans who are pretending to be Africans so that they won't be hated as Americans, right? And I mean, obviously, like, for any of us who are marginalized people, we can see like that as a metaphor for a great many number of things that we participate in, right? But you want to talk about like why in the Committed, what purpose does it serve?
Well, so there's just a very brief mention of a Black American jazz band that's been brought on board to play. Here, I'm going to give. Well, I don't know if I should give this away, but they're at a party. Let's just call it a party, okay? Yeah. And the people who have not read the book don't get what we're talking about. But anyway, so they're at this party, and you know, when I was in France, you know, it was always, it was very noticeable that obviously like African American jazz is a thing in French culture. You know, it's really held up as a major American art form. And Black Americans have obviously been welcomed in France. You know, we have a whole string of famous Black intellectuals from the United States who spent time in France, from Richard Wright to James Baldwin and so on. But, you know, there was this anecdote that Toni Morrison told about, you know, how she was obviously very welcomed in France. but she also, was invited to go to this French matron's place. But she brought along her African friend, and her African friend said, you might be making a mistake here because French people like Black Americans, but they don't. They have different feelings about Black people from their African colonies. And so it was important to get these kinds of nuances in there, because the French, I think the French are sort of, when they talk about the United States, have a love-hate relationship, but they're also kind of self-congratulatory, as I mentioned in the book. They're like, we're not like the Americans with their lynching and all of that.
Right.
And of course, what they don't acknowledge is there's quite a lot of racism in France, directed at people from France's colonies or descended from these colonized populations. And that is very painful, but it's also kind of funny.
Yeah.
When the Black jazz band members are like, shh, don't make us speak French.
Right.
Don't pretend that we can speak fluent French, because if we speak fluent French, they'll think we're Africans. But as long as we're African Americans, things are cool.
Right.
And the Fantasia thing, again, part of the fun, it's a reference to Paris by Night. Those of you who are Vietnamese or love Vietnamese people know about Paris by Night. It's our version of the song and dance show. I think it's like 140 episodes right now. And to me, that's our Hollywood. That's what we created when we couldn't get into Hollywood. And it's an enormous source of pride for Vietnamese people. And it's an enormous source of cultural power that we were able to create our own song and dance show. And even my parents, who are devout Catholics, watched this show, and I was like, you're devout Catholics, but there are these like half naked women here, and there are these like performers who might be gay, and all, but that was part of the space that Paris by Night and then here Fantasia creates. And I think part of the point I'm making there is that this is also revolutionary. This is also political. It's not like communist revolution, but it's political to claim our own pleasure, to claim our own representation in the diaspora where that's not allowed. And in Vietnam itself, in the years after the war, after the revolution, this was called yellow music, and it was outlawed. It was banned. It was considered decadent. And so like the Vietnamese had to smuggle Paris by Night into the country in order to watch it, because it was considered, just this westernized kind of contamination. And now, of course, if you go to Vietnam, it's like everything looks like Paris by Night. So.
Right. And, you talk a lot about, since The Sympathizer was set in America and explored American colonization and all these things, and the same character, which I feel like you fully inhabit and own in The Committed, which I enjoy so much. But now he's in France. And I think there's a great line where you say, the American, white supremacist or capitalist, right, gorges himself on as much bloody red meat as possible. It doesn't matter what it is, as much as there's more in big portions of it. Whereas the French prefers the refined cruelty of foie gras, right? So, like, how did you formulate that? Going into it, kind of thinking constantly about these two very different colonial powers.
Well, the final line, I believe, is that then you have the Chinese and Vietnamese versions of capitalism, which is dog eat dog capitalism. And I just have to say, I know that Jay Leno just apologized for his variety of anti-Asian jokes and so on, which apparently includes like Korean dog eating jokes, right?
Yep. Oh yeah.
But I, as a Vietnamese person, can make dog eating jokes, and I do so in this book. I'm very proud of my dog. Were you offended by the dog eating joke?
No, man. Come on, it's me.
Yeah. So, dog eating, I think, is not like outlawed. I mean, as a territory for jokes, okay. But I think that the issue of jokes is really important in these two books, because jokes are a way of showing power and how it works. Like when you joke, you're making fun of people who don't want to be joked about. Now that's different I think in both these novels, I hope what I'm doing is that I'm punching up. These jokes are designed to, I hope, puncture and unmask the operations of racism and capitalism and colonialism, which is different than punching down when you're making anti-Asian jokes about people eating dogs. That's very, very different. So my dog eating jokes, I think, have a political purpose. They're not just meant to demean people. So you have to read the book to see the dog eating joke. Which is completely intermeshed with a poop joke. So this is the world I'm operating. I have very low humor, and it's totally manifest in this book. So going back to go ahead.
No, well, I just want to, like, of all things, I went to a workshop on how to write children's literature, picture books, and it was specifically about humor. And I bring this up because you made me think of it. The two people who taught it, who were both white, they put their thesis, or their kind of framework, was that humor is actually about community, right? It's about being in on the joke. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, like a little kid, you put a duck in front of them, and the duck is wearing a hat, and it's like duck wearing a hat. And then the next picture is a duck wearing a hat. And the third picture is a duck, but it's sitting on the hat, and it's and everyone laughs because you know what the joke is about, right? Mm-hmm. And like, as kids, developmentally, their humor becomes more and more sophisticated, right? Mm-hmm. But when I went through that workshop, I thought also, like, what does that mean for those of us from marginalized communities, right? Like, that we are kind of in on the joke, and actually humor, even when it's very painful, is actually kind of like it's about community, because we're like, it's about us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so going back to the Jay Leno idea, I think and other comedians like that who make anti-Asian jokes, the ching chong stuff, the slang, whatever. We as Asian Americans, know that this is racist, right, because we know there's no love here. It's designed to mock us.
Right.
But I think of comedians like Margaret Cho and Russell Peters, and much of their routine at one point or another is based on Asian accents of various kinds. I don't find it offensive. I find it. I laugh. Because I think that like you're saying, you're in on the joke. You know that these jokes are being made with both by being immersed in these communities, but also set within a larger framework where they're not meant to demean. Right. They're meant to sort of celebrate the fact that, in fact, Asians do have accents, but it doesn't mean that we're stupid or that we're threatening or anything like that. It's instead, Margaret Cho and Russell Peters do these jokes in order to make a point about these people belonging where they are. Right. Or I recently rewatched the Dave Chappelle, one of his early, his first HBO special, and it was all about smoking pot and being pulled over by the cops and being scared that the cops are going to shoot him. Okay, now if a white guy was going to make these same jokes, but do it to make fun of black people, I would not find that funny. But Dave Chappelle is doing this in the context of inhabiting this from the inside, both to make a political critique. So he's not going to deny that he smokes pot, right? But he's not saying this is bad, right? And he's also making humor out of something that's actually really painful and real, which is being racially profiled. Right. So I think that's part of the question that for me, like when I deploy humor, it's exactly to do these kinds of things. It's to let people in on the joke, to let people in on the wider framework of how these jokes are being used to acknowledge the fact that, actually, Vietnamese people do eat dogs. I mean, we can't. When people say, "Oh, you Vietnamese people eat dogs," our response should not be to say, "No, we don't eat dogs," because factually, that's not true. Like, I've been to Vietnam, I've eaten a dog once, and that's it. And there's, people do it. So there's no point denying it. Instead, let's talk about it, and making a joke out of it can get us to see the function of dog eating in Vietnamese culture, but also, when I say that the Vietnamese and Chinese versions of capitalism are dog eat dog capitalism, I think that it's also a reference to the fact that now Chinese capitalism, for example, is the thing that the United States is afraid of. The thing that the United States is most afraid of right now is Chinese capitalism. And that's why there's some anti-Chinese rhetoric coming from across the political spectrum, whether it's explicitly racist like Donald Trump, or whether it's just sort of xenophobic like the Democrats. Right. That's what they're afraid of.
Right. Speaking of getting in trouble, so the first in your first book, The Sympathizer, you've talked about this at length, so it's not a spoiler. You've talked about the surprising thing that got you in trouble from The Sympathizer was the amorous, we'll call it the amorous scene involving a certain sea creature, right? Like you were surprised that got you in trouble, but it got you in trouble. What do you think is going to get you in trouble with The Committed?
I asked my publisher and editor and agent not to send me any reviews of this novel. And I think it was because, with the Sympathizer, that book came out and nobody knew who I was, nobody cared. And I wrote that book with that same spirit, like, the book was going to be for me. And if anybody else came along, that'd be great, and luckily for me, it did well. This novel, I had the same spirit. It's sort of like, okay, so the first novel did well, but I can't let that influence what I do in this novel. I still have to write it for me.
Yeah.
And so besides, there are poop jokes, there are, dog eating jokes, but there's also in this novel philosophy. And in the handful of reviews that I have seen, because they've snuck past the wall that I tried to erect, a couple of the reviewers mention it as if it was kind of number one, surprising, and number two, maybe like challenging for them. And that might get me. So it's a complete reverse of the Sympathizer, where some percentage of readers said, "Yeah, I just cannot get past this squid sex episode." And now it's like the reverse in The Committed, where people are like, I'm not sure I can deal with philosophy in a novel. And I'm like, that's equally, weird for me. I think of The Committed as a thriller. It's a crime thriller. Obviously, there's gangsters, there's crime, there's drugs, there's violence. But ideas and philosophy to me are also thrilling. And so that's the other dimension of this. Like, I talk about a number of philosophical philosophers that were really, important to me or formed me in one way or another. People like Frantz Fanon. And, I think that, for whatever reason, Americans don't like philosophy, or at least like the Americans who pick up novels don't like philosophy. Like, I don't know why a novel has to do with philosophy. My perspective is, why not? Why not have squid sex? Why not have philosophy? Why do we have these weird rules? Let's break these rules.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you and I can actually talk all night, but there are some folks. I have plenty of questions I want to ask you, but we're actually getting near the end. So why don't we, Amy? Do you want to? I'm sorry, Annie. Do you want to come back and moderate questions? And how's your cat Max doing? Is Max meowing?
Okay. I don't know where he is.
Okay.
Where's Max? Do you know? We'll find him. So we have some questions. So here is one from Mary. Just finished The Committed. Could you talk a little bit about your thinking in having the brothel figure prominently in the novel, especially regarding stereotypes of Asian women?
Yeah.
Brothel.
So they're so okay. So the Sympathizer, our gang, joins this gang. That's okay. So here's another thing. Here's another stereotype. So I went to France, talked to a bunch of Vietnamese people or French people of Vietnamese descent, said I'm going to write a crime novel set in this community. And they're like, we French of Vietnamese descent don't do that kind of thing. We don't do crime. We're not gangsters. And so I thought, oh, great. How do I solve this authenticity problem? So I said, well, I'm going to make this gang ethnic Chinese from Vietnam. And they're like, yeah, the Chinese would do that kind of thing. Okay. So, there's another stereotypical, rendition there. And so the gang who's led by this guy imaginatively called the Boss, does drugs and all that, but they also have a brothel called Heaven. Okay, so when I was writing The Sympathizer, I got to a certain point in writing that book where I thought, there's a lot of objectification of women happening in The Sympathizer, and that's happening because I created a narrator in The Sympathizer who's very masculine, and he's very amorous, and he thinks of himself as a playboy, and so he enjoys women. And I thought at a certain point that I was enjoying his enjoyment too much. And it made me think about, why. And, The Sympathizer itself ends with a horrific crime that is, in my mind, the culmination of heteronormativity, like the erotic drive that is there in heterosexual masculinity and the erotic drive that's there in warfare come together at a very horrifying moment at the end of the book. And that's very deliberate. But also, I felt, that actually what probably disturbed, honestly, some readers more than the squid sex episode, because the people who were disturbed by the squid sex episode stopped reading at that point.
Right.
But the other readers kept on going, and then they came to this final moment. And I know it was very disturbing for people, but I also felt that was the point. This is what happens when you unleash heteronormative masculinity in this way in the context of war.
Right.
And so The Committed, besides being everything that we already talked about, it's also a continuing journey for our narrator into his own masculinity and its problems. So he witnesses with ever increasing horror and shame as these two books progress how deeply implicated he is in heterosexuality and masculinity. And so that's why the brothel scene is there, because I think gangs do deal in brothels. And the sympathizer has to confront again, what is he supposed to do now that he is aware of some of these problems? And I don't know how much more to give away from that, but so yeah, that's why the brothel is there.
Yeah, and just very quickly, there's a way in which the character is a mess, right? The character is a mess. Like he, kind of getting beyond like the respectability politics that we may want to indulge in. He's a mess, and he's intentionally a mess, right?
Yeah.
And I think that makes the work stronger and more provocative. I mean, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, after you've been put through intense torture and re-education, you usually don't come out like a whole human being.
Yeah, you don't come out healthy. You don't come healthy out of that process. Yeah.
Right. I mean, a lot of people were damaged by their experiences in re-education, and there's no point just turning them into heroes as a result. I think that's what the Vietnamese community has done. The diasporic community is to turn re-education camp survivors into heroes. And it's not that they're not heroes, it's simply that if you inhabit them internally, the landscape might look really, really problematic. And so that's what this novel, like The Sympathizer, does. They're both confessions, they're both monologues. And in this case, I felt like, if that's what it is, then I have to inhabit his really kind of messed up personality, which I think is kind of funny, right? But it's also kind of disturbing in ways too.
Right.
I'm not doing a great job selling my own book, right? So
no, everybody, really quickly before you move on to the next question, it's also, I think, a very bleakly funny book. So I do think folks should give it a chance. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll also say too, like there's so many things quite literally kind of like rattling around his head, because his head is not good since all of the things he's been through. And so I really appreciated he kind of like works through new thoughts as they come to him, and as he like sort of re-establishes like how he feels about, in this case, women and misogyny and heteronormativity. So I think there's some really, really cool parts that come out of this being part of the setting. Okay, so here's something from Caitlin. Would you share a bit about your craft? Just finished The Sympathizer, and there are so many jaw-droppingly beautiful and fascinating sentences. Guess I don't have a precise question, just begging for a few clues to your magic. So you can take that whatever direction you want.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that question. I don't know if there is a clue. The craft part is to me, the art part to me is very mysterious. I can tell you about my routine and all that kind of thing, but then I can't really tell you how the sentences come out or how the images came out. But in The Sympathizer, I had a very magical moment in my life of 2 years where I was writing this book. I didn't have to go to work as a teacher. I had to leave from my university, and no one knew who I was, so I could just write in an undisturbed way. So I'd write 4 hours a day, and then I would go running in the afternoon, and that was part of the writing process too. And that was really kind of crucial because when I was running, after about half an hour, all these new ideas would come into my head. So I really felt like it was 2 years of near ecstasy in writing that book. It was like a dream experience. And the set, after I found the first sentence of the book, I'm a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces, I thought this sentence will carry the entire book. I mean, the rhythm of the entire book is in the one sentence. And it was very important to me to do that because these are two voice-driven novels. There's a lot of plot going on, but they're driven by the voice. You have to like the voice of the sympathizer, which means you have to like the rhythm of that voice. So establishing that rhythm from the beginning was really important. And so once I had the rhythm, then I could be carried along by that rhythm over the 2 years of writing that book. And in writing that book, I wrote it chapter by chapter, which meant that every time before I could move on to the next chapter, I would revise the previous chapter, and I would revise at the level of the sentence. So, I mean, the first draft was to sort of get the plot of the chapter down. The second draft was to get the language down, and I would write in reverse. So to avoid thinking about the narrative and just look at the sentence, I would read my chapters in reverse, and then that would allow me to isolate how the language was functioning. Because when you're caught up in the plot, it's easy to overlook how the language is functioning. So that was, I think, how the images came about, because I would look at each sentence and look at the rhythm and then try to think about how can I say something different at the level of the language, and how could I use a kind of an image to shock the reader into looking at the language or the situation anew. In The Committed, didn't work out the same way. So again, for me, like every book is different. And so with The Committed, I was really impacted by the publicity from the first book, and it was a much more disrupted writing schedule. And also the sympathizer himself had changed. So all the tricks that had worked for me in the first book, like the music I listened to, for example, didn't work in the second book. Or the books I used for inspiration in writing the sympathizer didn't work for me in the second book. So it was more of a struggle to write this particular novel. And I go back to the idea that Haruki Murakami in his book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Running, talks about, that book is about running, but it's also about writing, even though he never really says it. But it's like you run. It's exhausting. It's a kind of a discipline. You do it every day. You may really hate doing it, but at a certain point, you break through. And that's my experience on running was the same way. Like halfway through the struggle, all of a sudden my mind would clear, and whatever was inside of me would start pouring out. And that to me is what writing is about. The magic is inside somewhere. Like I can't tell you where the words and the images are coming from, but the problem is how do you tap into that? That's what the labor of the writing is about. And so he has another metaphor in What We Talk About When We Talk About running, which is like just digging a well. That's an image from his own work, right? Digging a well, you dig, and then you get to the water. And I think that's what we do as writers. We don't know how deep we have to dig. We don't know what kind of water we're going to find, but we have to do the digging. That's the labor of the art.
Yeah, thank you. Here's one from True. In this novel, you play around with font style and formatting, such as the het, fin, end moments that stand out for those of you who have read. What brought about this stylistic experimentation?
Mostly it was I just wanted to have fun. I think that's it. Like, we talked about rules a little bit earlier, and I think that for me, when I read contemporary American fiction, I think that there's a lot of rules that writers follow. And they learn those rules, I guess, in their MFA programs and by reading other contemporary American fiction. And I guess I've read enough of it, so I'm just not that interested. And in writing this book, I wanted to break rules just for the sake of breaking rules. Why not? And also because I have a 7-year-old kid, and I've seen him grow over the last few years, and he really loves to read, and he loves to read children's literature and comic books, and he's very naughty in what he finds to be amusing. And when you read a lot of children's literature, what I've seen is that the children's authors break rules all the time. And the kids break rules all the time, or they don't know what the rules are. And that allows them to do all kinds of weird, funny things. And so I took that spirit in this novel. Like when, as I was trying to think out what else could I do that would be interesting, just for the sake of being interesting to me anyway, then these ideas will start popping into my mind. Like, so for example, towards the end of the book, I introduce a font that you all know. It goes by various names, but the informal name for this font is Chopsticks or Chop Suey. Like whenever you see a Chinese restaurant, the stereotypical font for the name of the restaurant is in this font. So whenever someone says a stupid Orientalist thing in this book, at the end, it's rendered in the Chopsticks font, just to drive the point home. And why not? To me, that's, again, why not? That's one of the themes of this book. Why be constrained by conventions and rules?
Yeah, it's fun stuff happens on the page sometimes if you have not flipped through the book yet. Um, here's something from Carlos. Loves Sympathizer. Can't wait to read The Committed. What kind of stuff do you read, and who are some of your favorite novelists? I think we've talked about philosophy a little bit already. But.
Yeah, it's a tough question. What kind of stuff do I read? Well, one thing that I do read is actually poetry. That's another reason for the play with typography and fonts is that poets are oftentimes very playful with language on the page. And why not? And again, there's no rules here. You can just do whatever you want for whatever reason you want. And so I was really inspired by poets who do just by poetry in general and what they do. And I'm looking at Natalie Diaz's Post-Colonial Love Poem right now, for example, a great book. So I really recommend that. In terms of fiction and novels, I've really enjoyed Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown, won the National Book Award. That was fantastic, really entertaining, totally relevant to today's conversation about Hollywood. And it's a very funny novel. Steph Cha's Your House Will Pay, which is about Black and Korean conflict that looks a lot like what happened in LA during the Los Angeles riots. It's a thriller, and it's really, really gripping. Going back to the poetry issue, Don Mi Choi's DMZ Colony, which does great things with the play of language and pictures and photographs. It's about the division of Korea and the Korean War and its aftermath. I just found it to be really, really brilliant. So I mean that's 4 or 5 books for you to get started with right there.
And you didn't ask me, but I feel as an Asian American, it is my duty to plug Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, especially given the events of the last 2 weeks. I any opportunity I have, read Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong.
Absolutely. I think she just won the National Book Critics Circle Award today for that book, highly deservedly.
I think I glimpsed Interior Chinatown behind your head on your bookshelf.
Yeah, somewhere. Where is it? Right there.
Yeah, red one. So yeah, we had actually a comment a while back just complimenting your nice looking bookshelves. Very, very eye-catching.
They're all real books, by the way. There are no fake books here.
Yeah. Here's a question from B. I read your novels after reading Nothing Ever Dies regarding memory, politics, and war. When you write, what do you hope that readers remember about the Vietnam War as a historical event?
When I wrote the Sympathizer, I knew I was going into dangerous territory because here I am, a Vietnamese American writing about the Vietnam War, and I think in the racial dynamics of the United States, people will be like, yeah, of course, this guy's going to write what he knows about, and all he knows is Vietnam and the Vietnam War. So I think that's a valid reason why a lot of Vietnamese American writers don't want to write about the Vietnam War. And also, I think the way that it breaks down in the United States is sort of like American veterans write about the Vietnam War, and Vietnamese refugees write about Vietnamese refugees and Vietnamese Americans. And that to me is a way of sort of containing the meaning of the war. Both of these experiences are important, but in the Sympathizer, I want to try to bring these things together because to me, war and refugee experiences are the same thing. We have soldiers, but we also have civilians and all of that. And I wanted to write this sort of totalizing book about the Vietnam War in the Sympathizer. But, I also wanted to, defy this idea that, he's going to write about the Vietnam War because he's Vietnamese. And because to me, the Sympathizer is about the Vietnam War, but it's about the Vietnam War as an episode of American imperialism. So the larger frame is American imperialism. And, The Committed hopefully makes that very clear because it's not about the Vietnam War. It's about France and French colonialism and so on. But, the Americans came in and took over Indochina from the French. So whatever Americans want to call what they did in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, to me, it's imperialism and colonialism. So that's what these two books are about in one sense. And so I hope that's what people take away. It's hard enough for Americans just to understand the Vietnam War outside of their own ethnocentric framework, to think about how Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians and Hmong people have experienced that war. That's really challenging for Americans. But then to get even beyond that and to think of the Vietnam War as a part of American imperialism and American imperialism as a part of 500 years of colonization, that's nearly impossible for a good number of Americans. And the point of these two books is to locate ourselves in that history.
Right. And if I could just chime in very quickly, I think the events of the last 2 weeks and a lot of the discourse, and in some cases lack of discourse, kind of illustrate what you were just talking about, Viet, that we cannot, even on the left in America, we cannot conceptualize how US military imperialism and colonization is a racialized project that affects all of us, right?
I have an essay forthcoming, I think it's in this weekend in the Guardian Review, about the Atlantic killings. And it locates it in this long history of American warfare in Asia, American imperialism, settler colonization. And it ends with an image. And I just found out about this because I was reading some other article about the killings. One of the victims, Xiao Zhitan, was the only person of the 6 women who owned her own business, Young's Massage Parlor. And it's located, this is in the state of Georgia, okay? It's located in Cherokee Village. And of course, Georgia, there were Cherokee people lived there, and they were forcibly removed by the American military in 1838 and sent westward on what became known as the Trail of Tears, or what the Cherokee called the trail where we cried. And over 4,000 people died on this forced march west. To me, this brings together this history that we're talking about, that you can't separate anti-Asian violence and the mass shootings that are a part of American culture from the fact that, you have forcibly removed Indians through the use of the settler colonial violence that is fetishized and privileged as a part of American mythology, which Asian immigrants, Asian refugees coming into this country, claiming America and the American dream, we claim that mythology as well. And then that mythology can claim us.
How are you feeling? Can we do a few more questions?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. Here's one from David. The tension in the Sympathizer stems in part from the protagonist being a double agent. In what ways is his foray into criminal activities similar and different from the role of double agent?
The Sympathizer as a spy, who's able to feel empathy for all sides, in many ways stands in for the writer. And that's what we're supposed to do as writers. You're kind of a crappy writer if you can only empathize for one side, right? You have to be able to empathize with everybody. And then, and the figure of the spy, is there to reveal the operation of power. In The Committed, crime plays a similar role. I'm an unabashed fan of spy novels and crime novels, these so-called genres, partly because they're fun, and I hope these novels are fun, but also partly because the good spy writers and the good crime writers know that what they're talking about is not just a particular plot, but they're talking about politics on a grand scale. And so in the crime novel, good crime writers know that what's interesting is not just the individual crime, but what that crime says about systemic social crime. And that's what I find interesting in the crime genre. And that I think is what's happening in The Committed, that he gets involved in crime, and hopefully that makes it for if you like crime stories, hopefully that makes for a good read. But as he discovers, or as he reveals, all these terrible little crimes that are happening in terms of drug dealing and gangster violence and all that, they're nothing compared to the crime of colonization. And yet the crime of colonization is completely covered up by colonizing powers under the rhetoric of civilization, so that the French were colonizing all these countries and called it the civilizing mission, which was really just a mask for, enslaving people and stealing resources and all that kind of thing. But then what happens instead in France, then all the fear is around the individual petty criminal or the Muslim terrorist, or what these populations are who are not white, what kind of threat they pose to the French. when in fact it's the French who had posed a much greater threat to these countries that they colonized. So that's the crime. These are the layers of crime that take place in The Committed.
Yeah. That's good question, David. Okay, here's one from Mediopolis. Would you ever consider including the diacritics for the Vietnamese words in future prints? I really want to pronounce them correctly in my head. And then Amy seconded that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a mistake I made in the first novel, The Sympathizer. I didn't include the diacritics, and then I was going to do it for the second book, but my editor said, let's be consistent from one to the next. So I trust my editor. I went with him on this issue. I think we've seen a sea change, with in Vietnamese American literature. If you're someone who has read Vietnamese literature in translation into English, or read Vietnamese American literature, or read histories of Vietnam, up until maybe the last few years, there are no diacritical marks. And then we've just had writers who said, why not? Viet Than Nguyen, who unabashedly keeps her diacriticals in her name, wrote the novel The Mountain Sing, which I hope is in stock. It's a great novel that I described as the grapes of wrath for Vietnam and Vietnamese people. There are diacriticals in her work, and I think the new novel by Eric Nguyen, Things We Lost to the Water, which is coming out in April, has diacriticals in there as well. So I think Vietnamese American writers are increasingly defiant about this, that this is a part of our language, and we can't even say our names properly without these diacriticals in them. And so that was my error. I'm owning up to that, and in other works that I do, I think I will go use the diacriticals.
Cool. Thanks for that question, Mady and Amy. So I think this is our last question from Richard. Oh, no, excuse me, we have a new one too. So Richard says, absolutely transparent to a brilliant creativity. Thanks. Is the success of the first book a very mixed blessing, given what you say about the differences between writing that one and The Committed?
I don't think anyone can look at the first book and call it a mixed blessing. That'd just be kind of like, I mean, it was all great, right? So it was all great. How can I be, have mixed feelings about that? It does, I think, obviously elevate people's expectations for the second book, and I don't find that to be a mixed blessing. I think, it's just the reality of what happens after that. And for me, the challenge in writing the second book, or the second novel rather, was to put myself into a mental state where I wasn't going to think about what people thought. In writing The Sympathizer, it was a very crucial decision for me, after having spent 20 years writing a short story collection called The Refugees, where I was worried a lot about what people thought. In The Sympathizer, in writing The Sympathizer, it was a very crucial decision to say, it's for me. And that was very liberating. And I think that I've seen many writers, say that they also had that moment, that their big breakthrough moment is to just write for themselves. And so The Committed is written in that same spirit, and sort of a spirit of trying to be authentic to what I believe in, and also defiant in terms of what other people might expect from this novel, given what The Sympathizer accomplished and did. And I think that is the right spirit to keep writing in.
All right, I'm going to do this one last question because I think it's a good one to end on. Another one from David Murrah. Hi, David.
Hi, David.
The level of understanding of Asian Americans is still at the we all look alike, me love you, long time, China virus. Will our art ever change this? Will your art ever change this?
Well, I think that art, our art, our collective art as Asian American writers, of which David has played a crucial role, can change this. And I think it has to some extent already. When Jay Leno finally feels it to be necessary to apologize for dog eating jokes and whatnot, I mean, he's not responding to Asian American literature, but Asian American literature has been a part of this effort to say, this is wrong. And many of us have been saying it in different disciplines and different areas over and over and over and over again, and we're starting to make an impact. But unfortunately, obviously, it also required this sort of like guilty recognition on the part of non-Asians that maybe they have contributed to the environment in which somebody felt that they could go and kill Asian American women as a result. And so I think what's really crucial, what I always stress is that we should not underestimate literature, and we should not overestimate literature. I think people who are not in the literary world, people who are not writers and readers, underestimate literature. They say, what does it matter? And we who are writers and readers obviously believe it does matter. Stories matter. They're beautiful, they're escapist, they're empowering, all these kinds of things. But they're also necessary for storytelling. And if we have any hope of changing this country, it has to take place at least partly at the level of narrative. Changing the narrative of this country. And how do we do that except by having storytellers? But we can't overestimate literature either. I've heard a lot of writers say literature saved my life, and yes, it does obviously save the lives of people who read and write it. But people who don't read it, I'm quite aware, that there are many people who don't read books, much less read literature, and so we can't overestimate the power of literature, which means that literature plays a role in social change, but we also need the political and social movements that play a role in social change. And all of these operate together. I think of myself as an Asian American writer who has benefited from both the presence of earlier generations of Asian American writers, but also from the presence of an Asian American movement that has helped to create the conditions of possibility for Asian American literature to emerge as well. So these two things, the literature and the movement, go hand in hand. It still goes hand in hand. That literature can still hopefully transform our consciousness, give us a language, give us new images to assert ourselves. And we who are writers need the movement to continue to break down the walls that have kept us all confined in certain ways.
And could I just add, thank you for that, Viet. Could I just add, like someone the last 5-10 years, there's been a lot of talk about Asian privilege, right? And I think that, all of us, no matter what our race, our gender, it behooves us to think about our privilege, right? But I think one thing that's been frustrating is we never get to talk about where Asian people are actually underprivileged, right? And where Asian American people are underprivileged is exactly what you talked about. We actually don't have power to control our narrative. Really, in this country, we have very little power in the sphere of public domain in terms of like these grand narratives and dominant narratives about race and and power and like asking for nuance in our story, right? And I absolutely agree with you. Like the power of narrative is no small thing, right? And that's something that Asian American people need to work on and claim.
Absolutely.
Wow, you guys, this was so good, and I know that we could keep going, and I know that there's still people watching. Thank you all for still being here and asking such great questions. I did drop a link to the Committed at the Majors in Quinn website into the chat, so head there if you haven't yet gotten a copy. And thank you so much again to those of you who already did, and we'll have a wonderful evening, everyone. Viet, Bao, thank you so much again. This was awesome.
Well, thank you, Annie. Thank you, Majors and Quinn.
Yeah.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Bao.